A new beginning and an uneasy feeling. Jim Carter adjusted his cap, staring at his reflection in the streaked bathroom mirror of his small apartment. The dark circles under his eyes revealed the exhaustion of starting over again. At 40, he had worked countless jobs, each one ending in disappointment. But this one, at Hillcrest Academy, felt different. A fresh start. A chance to work in a school, among children, where he could at least feel like he was contributing to something meaningful. He just hoped this time would be different. His uniform was stiff, the fabric scratchy against his skin. The school's emblem, a golden hawk, was embroidered over his chest, but it didn't bring him any pride yet. He was just the janitor. To most people, that meant invisible. Jim had always prided himself on his work ethic, but society had never rewarded him for it. At his previous job at the hotel, he'd endured years of being overlooked, ignored, or outright disrespected. Guests barely acknowledged him. Managers treated him like furniture, and some coworkers, especially those who thought they were above him, acted like he didn't belong. When he had finally spoken up about mistreatment, they had found a reason to let him go. But now here he was, a new workplace, a new beginning. Jim took a deep breath and stepped outside. The crisp morning air nipped at his skin, but he ignored the chill. The walk to Hillcrest Academy was quiet, the streets mostly empty except for the occasional passing car. He had looked up the school before applying. One of the top-rated institutions in the district, known for its high academic standards and exclusive student body. The staff seemed professional, and the campus was pristine. Yet, as he approached the school gates, a strange feeling settled in his stomach. Something about this place felt off. He brushed the thought aside. It was just first-day jitters. He had to focus on making a good impression. As he walked through the entrance, the hallways were still quiet, the first bell yet to ring. The floors gleamed under the overhead lights, and the scent of floor wax mixed with the faint aroma of books and fresh paper. Jim made his way toward the janitor's supply closet, where he was supposed to check in. Just as he reached for the door, a voice called out, "You must be the new guy." Jim turned to see a woman in her 50s standing behind the reception desk. Her name tag read Eileen Morris. She had warm brown eyes and an easy smile, but there was something in her gaze, a quiet understanding, as if she knew something he didn't. "Yeah, that's me." "Jim Carter," he said, offering a small nod. "Welcome to Hillcrest Academy," she said. "You'll find the staff mostly friendly." But she hesitated, her eyes flickering toward something behind him. Jim frowned and glanced over his shoulder. There at the end of the hallway stood a tall man in an expensive gray suit. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp blue eyes bore into Jim like he was inspecting him. The man's neatly combed silver hair and commanding posture gave away his identity before Eileen even whispered the words. "That's Principal Robinson," she murmured. Jim had read about Robinson in the school's online faculty page. 5 years as principal, a reputation for strict discipline, and a no-nonsense approach to education. The students, it seemed, feared him. The parents respected him. But the staff? Jim wasn't so sure. Robinson's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he turned and disappeared into his office. Jim exhaled. He had worked under plenty of difficult bosses before. He just had to keep his head down and do his job. Eileen gave him a small, knowing smile. Word of advice: keep your distance. He doesn't like disruptions. Jim raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Instead, he simply nodded and went to retrieve his supplies. A playground encounter. The first few hours of the school day passed without incident. Jim fell into the familiar rhythm of work, mopping, wiping down windows, emptying trash bins. Most of the staff walked past him without much acknowledgement, except for a few polite smiles from some of the teachers. As he mopped near the playground, the sound of children's laughter filled the air. It was refreshing. It reminded him why he had taken this job, to be in an environment that felt alive. A group of younger kids ran past him, giggling as they played tag. One boy, his curly hair bouncing as he ran, stopped and pointed at Jim's mop. "What are you doing, mister?" he asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Jim smiled. "Keeping the floor clean for you guys. You don't want to slip and fall, do you?" The boy grinned. "Can I try?" Jim chuckled and handed him the mop. The boy excitedly swiped it across the pavement, his friends laughing at his exaggerated movements. It was a small moment, but for Jim, it felt good. A simple interaction, but one of mutual respect, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As he returned to work, his attention was drawn to a girl sitting alone on a bench near the lockers. She was small, maybe 8 or 9, with deep brown skin and dark, expressive eyes. Her backpack sat beside her, and she was holding a small carton of milk. Just as she went to punch the straw into it, another student, one of the older boys, accidentally bumped into her. The milk spilled over her hands and onto the ground. "Hey," she shouted, frustration evident in her voice. The boy barely turned around before running off. Jim didn't hesitate. He grabbed some napkins from his cart and walked over. "Here you go," he said gently. The girl looked up at him, surprised. She hesitated for a moment before accepting the napkins. "Thanks," she muttered, wiping her hands. Jim quickly mopped up the spilled milk. "Don't worry about the mess. Accidents happen." The girl gave him a small nod, but Jim noticed something else, something in the way she carried herself. She wasn't just upset about the milk. She looked alone. Jim had worked in enough places, seen enough people, to recognize that feeling. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl hesitated again, then softly said, "Maya." Jim offered her a warm smile. "Nice to meet you, Maya." Before he could ask anything else, the school bell rang. The playground erupted into movement as kids rushed toward their classrooms. Maya, however, didn't move right away. Instead, she lingered, waiting until most of the students had disappeared inside before getting up and walking toward the doors. Jim frowned. Why was she waiting? Why didn't she want to go in with the others? As she disappeared into the building, a voice from inside called out, "Maya, you're late again." It was a teacher's voice, firm and impatient. "This is the 3rd time this week." Jim's frown deepened. Something wasn't right, and he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Shadows behind closed doors. Jim Carter watched as Maya disappeared into the school building, her small shoulders slumped under the weight of something unseen. The moment played over in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. Why had she hesitated? Why had the teacher sounded more annoyed than concerned? His instincts told him that whatever was going on, it wasn't just about being late. With a sigh, he pushed his cleaning cart down the now empty corridor. The sounds of children settling into their classes faded into a distant hum. The day was just beginning, but the weight in Jim's chest told him this wasn't going to be just another ordinary shift. As he reached the administration hallway, the sound of voices drifted toward him, muffled but tense. One of them was deep and controlled, edged with irritation. The other was softer, uncertain. Jim recognized one of them instantly, Principal Robinson. He slowed his steps, pretending to clean as he approached the office door, which was slightly ajar. He didn't like to eavesdrop, but something about the tone of the conversation made his instincts flare. "You were late again, Maya." Robinson's voice was like ice, smooth but sharp. "Do you know how that looks? How many times do I have to remind you?" There was silence for a beat before Maya's small voice answered, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to be late. I was just..." "You were just what?" The principal's voice cut her off. "Playing outside, staring at the walls, trying to get attention. Because if that's the case, let me remind you, young lady, this is not your school." Jim froze. Not her school? What kind of principal said that to a child? His grip on the mop tightened as he fought the urge to storm in, but he knew better. He had to be careful. Maya's voice wavered. But I'm supposed to be here. Don't talk back, Robinson snapped. I've given you plenty of warnings already. You should be grateful you're still here at all. Jim felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Suddenly, the door opened wider, and Maya stepped out, her head down. She didn't see Jim right away, but when she did, her eyes widened in recognition. For a split second, he saw it again, that same quiet plea she had given him earlier. She hesitated, then hurried past him down the hallway. Jim barely had time to process what had just happened before Principal Robinson appeared in the doorway, his sharp eyes immediately landing on Jim. "You," Robinson said, his voice cool. "You're the new janitor, aren't you?" Jim straightened. "Yes, sir. Jim Carter." The principal studied him for a moment. "I expect my staff to be efficient. No slacking. No distractions. Understood." "Understood," Jim said, keeping his tone neutral. Robinson didn't move. "I also expect discretion. This is a private institution. We keep things in-house. If you hear things that don't concern you, I trust you'll remember your place." Jim met his gaze steadily. "I'm here to do my job, sir." "Good." The principal's lips curved into something that was supposed to resemble a smile, but it never reached his eyes. "Then get back to it." With that, he turned and disappeared back into his office, shutting the door behind him. Jim exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the mop handle. Discretion. That was a warning. But if the principal thought Jim was the type to turn a blind eye, he was wrong. Jim wasn't about to let this go. A whisper in the halls. As the day wore on, Jim did his best to act normal, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Maya. During lunch, he made his way to the cafeteria, keeping an eye out for her. The room was buzzing with students, their conversations and laughter blending into a chaotic symphony. Jim spotted Maya sitting alone at a far table, her tray barely touched. Before he could approach her, a blonde-haired girl sauntered up to Maya's table, a smirk plastered across her face. Jim recognized her. Michelle. He had seen her earlier with the other girls, loud, confident, the kind of kid who never had to worry about fitting in. "Hey, loser," Michelle sneered, picking up Maya's milk carton and tilting it over her tray, spilling it onto her lunch. Oops. Jim was already moving before Maya could even react. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, stepping up to the table. Michelle turned, her smug expression faltering when she saw him. "No," she muttered, stepping back. Jim looked at Maya. "You okay?" She nodded, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. He glanced at Michelle. "Clean up the mess." Michelle's face turned red. "I don't have to listen to you." Jim didn't budge. "You spilled it. You clean it." Michelle glanced around, realizing people were watching. Her jaw tightened, but after a long moment, she grabbed some napkins and wiped the mess off the table. Satisfied, Jim nodded. "Good. Now go." Michelle shot Maya one last glare before storming off. Jim turned back to Maya, but before he could say anything, she whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." "Why not?" Maya swallowed, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "She'll tell the principal, and he'll make it worse." Jim felt something cold settle in his chest. How deep did this go? Before he could ask anything else, the lunch bell rang. Maya quickly grabbed her tray and hurried away, leaving Jim standing there, a sinking feeling in his gut. This wasn't just a bad school experience. Something much worse was happening here, and Jim wasn't going to ignore it. An ominous discovery. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Jim kept himself busy with cleaning, but his mind was elsewhere. The principal's words, Maya's fear, the way Michelle had acted like she could do whatever she wanted, without consequences. Jim had seen this kind of dynamic before. He knew what unchecked power looked like. Near the end of his shift, he found himself in the teacher's lounge, wiping down tables. Most of the staff had already left for the day, but as he moved past the counter, Something caught his eye. A folder. It was sitting open, a few sheets of paper sticking out. Jim wasn't the type to snoop, but as he moved to close it, a name jumped out at him. Maya Carter. His pulse quickened. It was a student report, but instead of grades or behavioral notes, it had a single word stamped across the top in bold red letters. F-E-or-P-E-N-D-ing. Jim's hands clenched into fists. They were trying to get rid of her. He didn't know what kind of game the principal was playing, but one thing was clear: Maya wasn't safe here. And Jim wasn't going to let this stand. Not again. Not this time. The truth hiding in the shadows. Jim Carter's fingers hovered over the student report, his breath coming slow and steady as his mind processed what he was seeing. F-E-or-P-E-N-D-ing. The two words stamped across Maya's file sent a wave of anger coursing through him. They weren't just trying to punish her. They were trying to erase her. He carefully flipped through the rest of the report, scanning the notes. It was written in vague, diplomatic language, but the intent was clear. Behavioral issues, failure to adapt, non-compliance, difficulty integrating into the school environment. Bullshit. Jim had seen Maya. She wasn't a troublemaker. She was just a kid trying to survive in a place that had already decided she didn't belong. He needed proof, something that would expose what was really happening. Carefully, he pulled out his phone and snapped a quick photo of the report before placing it back exactly as he found it. His heart pounded as he stepped away from the counter, grabbing his cleaning rag and moving to wipe down the rest of the lounge. He forced his hands to stay steady. Just act normal. The last thing he needed was for someone to walk in and find him standing over a student's private file. The room remained empty as he finished his work, but the tension in his body didn't fade. He had found something big. But what was he supposed to do with it? A warning from the past. Jim finished his shift and made his way to the janitor's supply room, hanging up his mop and washing his hands in the small sink. The room was quiet, the distant sound of students leaving for the day filtering in through the slightly open door. As he dried his hands, he heard footsteps approaching. When he looked up, Eileen was standing in the doorway. She looked at him carefully, then closed the door behind her. "You're getting too close," she said in a low voice. Jim frowned. Close to what? You know what? Jim studied her, trying to gauge how much she knew. "Eileen, why are they trying to get rid of Maya?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Because she's a problem to them, and problems get removed." Jim felt his jaw tighten. "She's a child. She hasn't done anything wrong." Eileen let out a humorless laugh. "That doesn't matter to Robinson. You think she's the first student he's tried to push out? No, she's just the latest." Jim's stomach turned. "Who else?" Eileen hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know all the names, but I do know this. Every black or brown student that enrolls here, they don't last long. Some get harassed until their parents pull them out. Others just disappear from the roster one day. No explanation, no notice." Jim stared at her. "Why haven't you told anyone?" Eileen's eyes darkened. "Who do I tell, Jim? The school board. Half of them are in Robinson's pocket. The other half just look the other way." "That's not an excuse," Jim said, his voice sharp. "No," Eileen agreed, "but it's reality." Jim leaned against the wall, running a hand over his face. "So what? We just let this happen." Eileen crossed her arms. "No, but if you're planning to do something, you'd better be smart about it. Because Robinson doesn't just get rid of students, he gets rid of staff too. You think you're the first janitor to notice something off. The last guy, Ronald, he barely lasted a week before Robinson fired him. No reason given." Jim felt a chill go down his spine. He had wondered about the previous janitor. Now he had his answer. Eileen lowered her voice. "If you really want to help that girl, be careful. Don't let Robinson see you coming." Jim met her gaze. "I don't scare easy." Eileen shook her head. "Then you'd better be ready for a fight." She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, disappearing into the after-school crowd. Jim took a deep breath. A fight. Fine. But if Robinson thought Jim was just some janitor who would keep his head down and ignore the truth, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. A desperate plea. Jim had just finished locking up the janitor's supply room when he heard it. Soft, hurried footsteps approaching from behind. He turned just in time to see Maya. She was alone, her wide brown eyes darting nervously down the hall, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Mr. Jim," she whispered urgently, "I need your help." Jim immediately crouched down to her level. "What's wrong, Maya?" She bit her lip, glancing over her shoulder. "The principal. He told me I can't come back next week. He said my parents are already signing the transfer papers." Jim's blood ran cold. They were moving fast. Too fast. "Maya, listen to me," he said carefully. "Did your parents tell you this, or just the principal?" She shook her head. "Just him. But he told me if I said anything, he'd make it worse." Jim clenched his jaw. "Worst how?" Maya hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He told me if I don't leave, he'll make sure I regret it." Jim felt something inside him snap. That was it. Enough was enough. No more waiting. No more playing it safe. "All right, Maya," he said firmly. "You did the right thing by telling me. But I need you to do one more thing for me, okay?" She nodded quickly. "I need you to tell your parents. Everything. Tonight. Can you do that?" Maya swallowed hard. "They won't believe me." Jim placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then tell them to call me. I'll make them believe you." Maya hesitated, then gave a small nod. The sound of a door opening down the hall made them both stiffen. "Principal Robinson." Jim immediately stood, putting himself between Robinson and Maya. The principal's icy blue eyes flicked between them, his expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, "shouldn't you be heading home?" Maya nodded quickly and scurried off without another word. Robinson watched her go, then turned his gaze back to Jim. "I hope," he said slowly, "that you're not getting too comfortable here, Mr. Carter. People who overstep their roles tend to find themselves replaced." Jim didn't blink. "You threatening me, sir?" Robinson smirked. "Of course not. I'm simply reminding you that your job is to clean, not to interfere." Jim took a step forward. "And I'm reminding you that my job is to make sure this school is a safe place. And right now, it's not." Robinson's smirk faded. For the first time, he looked unsettled. Jim didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked away, his heart pounding. Tomorrow, he would bring the fight to Robinson's doorstep. Because Maya wasn't leaving this school. But Robinson, he was. The storm breaks. Jim Carter barely slept that night. His mind ran through every possibility, every move Principal Robinson might make. This wasn't just about Maya anymore. If Robinson had done this before, how many other students had he quietly forced out? How many families had he manipulated? Jim had spent his whole life trying to mind his own business, trying to stay out of trouble. But now he was in it, and there was no backing down. When the sun rose, Jim was already dressed and heading to Hillcrest Academy. This time, he wasn't just the janitor. He was the watchdog, a silent witness. The school hallways were quiet when Jim arrived early that morning. As he made his way to the janitor's supply room, he saw a familiar figure standing at the front entrance, Eileen. She looked nervous, her fingers twisting together. "You need to be careful," she said without greeting. "Robinson is planning something." Jim frowned. "What do you mean?" Eileen glanced around before lowering her voice. "He's holding a private meeting with the school board today. The last time he did that, someone got fired." Jim's gut tightened. He already knew who that someone was going to be. "Let me guess," Jim said, voice dry. "He's getting rid of me." Eileen didn't confirm it, but she didn't deny it either. You're a problem, Jim. He doesn't like problems. Jim exhaled, rubbing his chin. He's not as smart as he thinks he is. I have proof. I found Maya's transfer papers. They're trying to force her out. Eileen's eyes widened. Did you take them? Jim shook his head. No, but I took pictures. For the first time, a spark of hope flickered across Eileen's face. That's something. But you need more. Jim nodded. I know. That's why I need your help. She hesitated. What are you planning? Jim's lips curled into a grim smile. I'm going to make sure everyone sees who Robinson really is. The breaking point. The morning passed without incident, but Jim knew the quiet wouldn't last. He worked his usual rounds, cleaning classrooms, sweeping floors, but he was watching. He saw how teachers avoided eye contact when Robinson walked past. He saw how some students shrank away from him. But most importantly, he saw Maya. She was sitting at her desk in her classroom, her eyes locked on her paper, pretending to work. But Jim could tell she was waiting for something. Waiting for the next punishment. Waiting for the next disciplinary action. Jim clenched his fists. Not today. A plan in motion. By lunchtime, Jim had everything in place. He had slipped into the teacher's lounge earlier and placed a small recording device under one of the tables. If Robinson was going to say something incriminating, Jim was going to catch it. He just had to wait. Sure enough, the moment came faster than expected. Jim was wiping down a window near the administration office when he heard raised voices from inside. He froze, then took a few quiet steps toward the slightly open door. Inside, Robinson was speaking with a member of the school board. Listen, Robinson said, his voice tense. I don't need another headache. That girl, Maya, she's making this difficult, and that damn janitor is sniffing around too much. The school board member sighed. Are you sure this won't cause problems? It won't if we handle it correctly. Robinson snapped. Her parents will sign the transfer papers today. As for the janitor, he won't last the week. Trust me. Jim's blood went ice cold. There it was. The proof. He carefully backed away, slipping into the hallway unseen. He had what he needed. Now it was time to bring it all crashing down. The confrontation. Jim didn't waste time. He grabbed his phone, found the recording file, and sent it to Eileen. Then he sent it to Maya's parents. Then he sent it to the local news station. He wasn't playing anymore. By the time the final bell rang, Jim was standing outside the principal's office, waiting. And sure enough, Robinson stormed out, his face twisted in rage. You, he hissed. What the hell did you do? Jim folded his arms, exposed the truth. Robinson took a step forward, but Jim didn't back down. Your time's up, Jim said evenly. The school board will be here any minute. Maya's parents are on their way. And that little meeting you had, Jim tapped his phone. Yeah, I recorded that. Robinson paled. You think you can take me down? He growled. Jim smiled. No, I know I can. Before Robinson could respond, the front doors burst open. Maya's parents arrived, followed by members of the school board. Behind them, reporters. It was over. Robinson tried to salvage the situation, but the moment the recording was played aloud, the entire school fell silent. Teachers whispered. Students peeked from their classrooms. And Robinson, he knew he was done. Justice served. By the end of the day, Robinson was removed from his position. Maya's transfer papers were shredded in front of her parents. And Jim. He quit before they could fire him. As he walked out of Hillcrest Academy for the last time, Maya ran up to him. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but strong. Jim crouched down, smiling at her. You're going to be okay now, kid. Maya nodded, then reached out and hugged him. Jim wasn't sure when the tears started, but he didn't fight them. For the first time in a long time, he had made a difference. And that was worth everything. Jim Carter stood in the hallway. his heart hammering in his chest as the doors to the administration office swung open. The heavy thud of Principal Robinson's polished shoes echoed against the pristine floors as he stormed toward Jim, his face contorted with rage. "You," Robinson spat, his voice dangerously low. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jim stood his ground, his arms crossed over his chest. "Making sure the truth comes out," he said, his voice steady. The hallway was eerily silent. Students and teachers had started to gather, sensing the tension in the air. Some peered from behind doorways, while others whispered in hushed voices. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Robinson continued, stepping closer. His breath was hot with fury. "You think you can just interfere in things you don't understand." "I understand enough," Jim shot back. "Enough to know that you're a racist coward who's been abusing his position for years. And now, you've finally been caught." Robinson's face turned a deep shade of red, and for a moment, Jim thought the man might actually throw a punch. Instead, he let out a forced, bitter laugh. "You really think you're some kind of hero?" Robinson sneered. "You're nothing but a janitor. A nobody." Jim's jaw clenched. That word, nobody, it wasn't just an insult. It was a weapon. One Jim had heard too many times in his life. But not today. Not here. Not in front of Maya. "You're wrong," Jim said calmly. "I'm the one who stood up when no one else would. I'm the one who refused to let you bully a child out of her education. And right now, I'm the one holding all the cards." He pulled out his phone, playing the recording. Robinson's voice crackled through the speaker for everyone to hear. "That girl, Maya, she's making this difficult. And that damn janitor is sniffing around too much. Her parents will sign the transfer papers today. As for the janitor, he won't last the week. Trust me." The air was electric. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Teachers exchanged shocked glances. Some students covered their mouths. Robinson's composure cracked. His eyes darted around, as if looking for an escape. "You," he started, but his voice faltered. Then, the front doors of the school burst open. The reckoning. Maya's parents arrived first, their faces tight with fury. Mrs. Carter's hands were clenched at her sides, but her eyes, dark, burning, landed directly on Robinson. "Where is my daughter?" she demanded, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Robinson's lips parted, but before he could speak, the school board entered. Jim had expected them to slither in quietly, hoping to sweep the issue under the rug. But when the reporters and cameramen followed behind them, the game changed. Microphones were raised. Cameras flashed. A female reporter stepped forward, her professional smile masking the predatory glint in her eyes. "Principal Robinson, do you care to explain why a recording has surfaced, detailing an attempt to force out a young black student from this institution?" The question cut through the room like a blade. Robinson froze. Jim could almost see the gears turning in his head, desperately trying to find an excuse, a way out. "There's been a misunderstanding," Robinson finally said, forcing a strained chuckle. "This recording has clearly been taken out of context. I have always acted in the best interests of this school and its students." Maya's father stepped forward. "So calling my daughter a problem was in her best interests." More whispers spread. Some teachers looked away, ashamed. Jim folded his arms. "What about the past students? The ones you forced out before Maya? Should we start calling their parents too?" The reporters pounced on that, their cameras shifting toward Robinson, microphones pushing closer. The school board members, sensing a PR disaster, exchanged quick glances. Then one of them, a tall, older man with silver hair, stepped forward. His name tag read Gerald Lawson, head of the board. "This is a very serious allegation," Lawson said slowly, eyeing Robinson. "We will need to conduct an immediate review of all disciplinary actions taken under your leadership, as well as all student removals in the past 5 years." Robinson paled. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I have given my life to this school. I have worked tirelessly to uphold its standards, and you're going to throw me under the bus because of some janitor and a troublemaking student." Jim saw it then, the moment Robinson realized he had lost. Because nobody was backing him up. Not the teachers, not the school board, and definitely not the cameras now broadcasting his downfall. A last act of defiance. "You can't do this to me," Robinson growled, stepping closer to Lawson. "I built this school's reputation. I made this institution what it is today. You have no right to." "That's enough." The voice didn't come from Jim, or the board, or even Maya's parents. It came from Maya. She stood near the crowd, her small hands clenched into fists, her chin lifted high. "You don't belong here," she said firmly. "This isn't your school." The irony wasn't lost on Jim. She had finally said it back to him. Robinson's face twisted in pure hatred, but he couldn't lash out. Not now. Not in front of everyone. Lawson straightened his tie. "As of this moment, Principal Robinson, you are placed on indefinite leave. An investigation will begin immediately. Please gather your belongings and leave the premises." It was over. Robinson staggered back, his face slack with disbelief. Then, with one last sneer toward Jim, he turned and walked out. Aftermath. The moment Robinson was gone, the tension in the room broke. Some students cheered. Others hugged Maya, whispering words of encouragement. Jim exhaled deeply, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. Maya's mother immediately rushed forward, gathering her daughter into a tight embrace. "It's over," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "You're safe." Jim watched the scene unfold, a lump forming in his throat. He had done it. For the first time in his life, he had fought not just for himself, but for someone else. And it had mattered. As he turned to leave, Maya ran up to him. "Mr. Jim," she said softly. He looked down. "Yeah, kid." Maya hesitated, then wrapped her arms around him in a small, tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. Jim smiled, gently patting her back. "You're gonna be okay, Maya." As he stepped back, he caught sight of Eileen standing nearby, her arms crossed, an amused smirk on her face. "You know," she said, "for a janitor, you sure did one hell of a job today." Jim chuckled. "Yeah. But I think I'm done with cleaning up other people's messes." She raised an eyebrow. "So, what now?" Jim looked out at the school one last time, thinking about Ronald, the janitor before him, thinking about all the students who never got justice, thinking about the long road ahead. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think I just found my purpose." And that was enough. A new battle begins. The dust had settled at Hillcrest Academy. Principal Robinson was gone. His removal was swift and humiliating, and the school was now under investigation. But Jim Carter knew better than to believe the fight was over. Injustice didn't just disappear, it adapted. The morning after Robinson's departure, Jim expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt something else: restlessness. Because while the man himself was gone, the system that protected him still remained. And that meant there was still work to do. The return of an old ghost. Jim arrived at school earlier than usual, his footsteps echoing down the halls before most of the staff had even clocked in. He went straight to the janitor's closet, but before he could reach for his mop, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You should have left this alone." Jim turned, and for a split second, his breath caught. Standing in the hallway was Ronald, the janitor who had come before him, the one who had disappeared. Ronald looked older than Jim remembered from the photos he'd seen. The man's dark skin had deep lines of exhaustion, his posture weary but strong. His uniform was different, suggesting he had found another job somewhere else. But his eyes still carried the weight of knowing. Jim recovered from his shock quickly. "I didn't expect to see you here." Ronald smirked slightly. "Yeah, well, I heard the news. Figured I'd drop by and see for myself. Jim crossed his arms. You told anyone what happened before you left? Ronald let out a bitter laugh. And who was I supposed to tell, Jim? Robinson had the board in his pocket. He had teachers scared to speak up. Even parents didn't want to rock the boat. Jim exhaled. I get it. But things are changing now. Ronald studied him carefully. You think so? Jim nodded. Robinson's out. The investigation's real. But there's still work to do. Ronald's expression darkened. Then be careful, Jim. 'Cause if there's one thing I learned in my time here, it's that men like Robinson, they don't operate alone. Jim felt a chill go down his spine. You think someone else is pulling the strings? He asked. Ronald took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. I know they are. The shadows that remain. Ronald left soon after, but his words stayed with Jim. By the time the students arrived, the tension in the air had shifted. There was a buzz in the school, a mix of cautious hope and lingering fear. Jim noticed it immediately. The teachers, who had once avoided his gaze, now nodded at him in quiet respect. The students whispered about what had happened, their voices carrying an energy that hadn't been there before. But there was another presence, a cold, silent force pressing against the school. Jim caught it in the way some of the older staff members watched him as he walked past. He felt it in the way some teachers hesitated before speaking, as if afraid of being overheard. Most of all, he saw it in the new faces that arrived that morning. One of them stood out, a man in a navy blue suit, standing near the main office. Jim had never seen him before, but he didn't need an introduction to know what he was. A replacement. Not a new principal, not yet, but a temporary figure, here to smooth things over, to keep things from unraveling too much. Jim kept his distance, but he caught enough of the conversation between the man and one of the administrators. Damage control, the man was saying. We need to focus on reputation first. Reputation, not justice, not accountability, just keeping things quiet. Jim clenched his fists. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. Maya's revelation. By lunchtime, Jim had already decided he wasn't going to wait for the school to fix itself. If Robinson had backers, he was going to find them. He was refilling the mop bucket in the janitor's closet when he heard the door creak open behind him. Mr. Jim. Jim turned. Maya stood in the doorway, her small hands clasped together. You okay, kid? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Maya hesitated, then nodded. I wanted to say something. Jim leaned against the wall. Go ahead. Maya glanced around nervously before stepping inside, lowering her voice. When I was in Principal Robinson's office, I saw a folder on his desk. Jim's body went still. A folder. Maya nodded quickly. It had names in it. Not just mine. Other kids too. Kids who were different. Jim inhaled sharply. Different how? Maya swallowed. Like me. Jim's stomach twisted. The folder wasn't just about Maya. It was about every student Robinson had targeted. Maya, he said carefully, do you remember any of the names? She nodded. A few. But I think the folder is still in the office. Jim felt his heartbeat quicken. The proof was still here. He just had to find it. Breaking into the past. Jim didn't waste time. By the time the last bell rang, he had a plan. He had overheard some of the remaining administrators talking about a meeting off campus, which meant the office would be mostly empty. If there was ever a time to act, it was now. The hallways were clearing, students filing out the doors. Jim moved quickly, blending into the background as he approached the administration wing. His heart pounded as he reached Robinson's old office. The door was locked. But Jim had spent years working low-wage jobs, learning tricks from maintenance workers and security guards along the way. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thin metal card he had once used to pop open stubborn hotel doors. He slid it into the frame, wiggled it just right. Click. The door creaked open. Jim slipped inside, closing it behind him. The office was untouched. Robinson's desk still held a stack of papers, a few pens, and a locked drawer on the side. Jim moved fast, rifling through the stacks, until he found it. A manila folder, labeled Enrollment Review. Jim flipped it open, and what he saw made his breath hitch. Inside were dozens of student files. Names, faces, dates. Each file contained notes on students that Robinson had marked as problematic. Many of them were Black, Hispanic, or from other minority backgrounds. Some notes had recommendations: encourage transfer, classroom isolation, discipline frequently. Jim's hands trembled. This was proof. Proof that it wasn't just Robinson. It was the system itself. And now Jim had everything he needed to tear it down. Unmasking the system, Jim Carter had the proof in his hands. A manila folder filled with names, children who had been quietly pushed out of Hillcrest Academy under Robinson's administration. This wasn't just about Maya. It never had been. The weight of the truth settled heavily in Jim's chest. This was bigger than one corrupt principal. This was an entire system designed to keep students like Maya, students who didn't fit a certain image, out of the school. And Jim, he was going to burn it all down. The escape. The office was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the distant hum of the school's ventilation system. Jim carefully flipped through the pages, taking as many photos as he could on his phone. Names, dates, targeted students. He had enough evidence to take this all the way to the district. But as he reached the last few pages, his stomach twisted. At the very bottom of the list was a single entry. Ronald McKay, terminated. Reason: unauthorized questioning of school policies. Jim clenched his fists. Ronald, the janitor before him, had been fired for asking too many questions. Jim knew then that he wasn't just dealing with racism. He was dealing with an institution built to silence anyone who resisted. Click. The sound of the office door handle turning sent a spike of adrenaline through Jim's veins. Someone was coming. Without thinking, Jim grabbed the folder and ducked behind the desk. The door creaked open, and a pair of heavy footsteps entered the room. Jim held his breath. A chair scraped against the floor, followed by the rustling of papers. Then, a voice. "I told them we should have locked everything up." Jim recognized it immediately. Gerald Lawson, the head of the school board. Jim's blood ran cold. "Doesn't matter now," a second voice said. "Robinson's gone, but the story is already out. We need to get ahead of this before the parents start asking too many questions." Jim peered through the small gap between the desk and the chair. Two men stood near the filing cabinet, Lawson and another administrator Jim had seen before but never spoken to. "We can't just erase all these records," the second man muttered. "It'll look suspicious." Lawson scoffed. "We don't erase. We adjust. The school needs to maintain its reputation. These kids, their families, they don't belong here. They never did. If the media starts sniffing around, we'll say it was all standard academic transfers. We've done it before." Jim felt a sickening rage rise in his chest. These men weren't just covering for Robinson. They were part of the machine. And they didn't even care. Lawson sighed. "Just shred anything that could raise suspicion. I'll handle the press." Jim's heart pounded. If he didn't get out of there now, he was going to get caught. Slowly, carefully, he inched toward the side door, the emergency exit that led to the back hallway. 1 step, 2 steps. "Hold on," Lawson's voice cut through the silence. "Where's the enrollment folder?" Jim didn't wait to hear the rest. He bolted. The door swung open with a sharp creak, and Lawson's voice erupted behind him. "Hey, who's there?" Jim sprinted down the hallway, the folder clutched in his hands. Behind him, footsteps thundered against the floor as Lawson and the other man gave chase. But Jim knew the school better than they did. He darted around a corner, ducking into the stairwell that led to the basement storage rooms. Breath coming fast, he pressed himself against the cold brick wall. Footsteps rushed past. Then silence. Jim exhaled. He had what he needed. Now he just had to figure out what to do with it. A dangerous gamble. Jim spent the rest of the evening thinking. The folder sat on his kitchen table, illuminated by the dull glow of his apartment's overhead light. He could go to the school board, but they were part of the cover-up. He could go to the media, but without someone else backing him up, it might not be enough. Then he had an idea. A dangerous idea. He picked up his phone and dialed the one person who hated Robinson even more than he did. Maya's mother. The line rang twice before a sharp voice answered. "Hello. Mrs. Carter, it's Jim Carter," he said quickly. "I have something you need to see. Something that proves Maya wasn't the only student Robinson was trying to force out." There was a brief pause. Then, "Where do you want to meet?" Exposing the truth. They met in a small diner on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Carter arrived first, her face tense and unreadable. Jim slid the folder across the table. She opened it. And then, as she flipped through the pages, her expression hardened into something dangerous. Her hands clenched around the documents. "These are kids," she whispered. "They tried to erase children." Jim nodded grimly. "And they're still trying." She took a slow breath. Then, she picked up her phone and made a call. Jim listened as she spoke, her voice clipped and businesslike. "Yes, I need an urgent meeting with the district superintendent." "No, I don't care if it's late. You tell them it's about the Hillcrest Academy investigation." Jim's eyebrows lifted slightly. Mrs. Carter noticed. She hung up the phone and smirked. "You didn't think I was just going to sit on this, did you?" Jim chuckled. Not for a second. Her eyes darkened. Robinson was just the beginning. "We're not stopping until the whole damn system burns." Jim sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. For the first time since stepping into Hillcrest Academy, he felt hope. But more than that, he felt ready. The final stand. The next day, the school was in chaos. Jim walked through the hallways as whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you hear? The district is launching a full investigation. The news is covering it now. They found evidence, real evidence." Teachers looked nervous. Students looked hopeful. And Lawson. Jim found him standing outside the administration office, pale and silent. Jim stopped beside him. "Looks like you're in trouble," he said casually. Lawson didn't respond. Jim leaned in. "You should have shredded that folder sooner," he whispered. Then he walked away, smiling. For the first time in years, the system was breaking. And Jim Carter, he was the one holding the hammer. The fall of the system. Jim Carter had never been the type to seek revenge. He had always been the kind of man who swallowed his pride, kept his head down, and did what needed to be done. But as he stood in the middle of Hillcrest Academy, watching the system that had protected Principal Robinson crumble, he realized something. Sometimes, the only way to fix something broken is to burn it down. The board meeting that changed everything. 2 days after exposing the school's corruption, Jim found himself standing in front of the district superintendent's office. Inside, the room was filled with the highest-ranking officials in the school district. School board members, administrators, and even a few high-profile parents were gathered around a long, polished table. At the head of the table sat Gerald Lawson, the man who had tried to keep everything quiet. But now, he looked less like the confident leader from before and more like a man cornered. Jim sat beside Maya's parents, who had been invited to testify. The meeting began, and it wasn't long before things got heated. "You had knowledge of Principal Robinson's discriminatory practices," one official accused Lawson. "Yet, you and your board did nothing to stop it." Lawson cleared his throat. "We had no concrete proof until now. We are deeply saddened by this situation." Jim slammed his hand on the table. "Bullshit." Gasps filled the room. Lawson turned red. "Excuse me." Jim leaned forward. "You had proof. You had it for years. The student files, the transfer papers, the complaints from teachers who quit. You knew exactly what was happening." Silence. Then, one of the school district officials cleared their throat. "Mr. Carter, do you have evidence to support your claims?" Jim didn't hesitate. He reached into his bag and pulled out printed copies of every document he had taken from Robinson's office. The room went dead silent as they flipped through the pages. Mrs. Carter's voice was cold as she read from one of the reports. Recommended classroom isolation. Repeated warnings for cultural differences. Encourage voluntary withdrawal. Her hands trembled with anger as she set the papers down. "How many kids have you done this to?" Lawson opened his mouth, but another board member, the only one who had looked disgusted since the meeting started, spoke first. "We need to put this to a vote," she said, her voice shaking. "This board needs a complete overhaul. We can't just let this slide." Jim saw panic flicker across Lawson's face. Because he knew. This was the end. The verdict. An hour later, the official decision came down. The school board would be dismantled and restructured. Multiple administrators, including Lawson, were permanently removed. And Hillcrest Academy, it would be placed under direct oversight by the state education department for the next 5 years. More importantly, every student who had been forced out under Robinson's rule was being contacted. They would be offered full reinstatement with scholarships. It wasn't perfect, but it was justice. Jim stood outside the district office, breathing in the crisp afternoon air. Maya's mother turned to him. "You did this," she said softly. "You made this happen." Jim shook his head. "No, we did this. You, Maya, the teachers who spoke out. I just took the first step." Maya's father reached out, shaking his hand. "So what's next for you?" Jim exhaled. "I don't know. Maybe I'm done cleaning up other people's messes." Maya's voice suddenly cut through the air. "Mr. Jim." Jim turned just in time for her small arms to wrap around him. For a second, he didn't know what to do. Then he gently patted her back. "You're gonna be okay now, kid," he murmured. She pulled back, her bright eyes full of something new. "Hope." She smiled. "You too." Jim felt his chest tighten. Yeah, maybe for the first time in a long time, he would be okay too. Epilogue. A new beginning. 1 week later, Jim found himself in an unfamiliar place, a community center. He had been invited by one of the teachers from Hillcrest, someone who had seen what he did and wanted to help. Inside, there were dozens of kids. Kids who had been failed by the system. Kids who needed mentors. Kids who needed someone to stand up for them. Jim was still just a janitor. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. But maybe, just maybe, he could be something more. As he stepped into the room, the noise of children laughing and talking surrounded him. One of the teachers smiled, ready to help change more lives. Jim Carter smiled back. "Yeah," he said, "let's get to work."